Today in geometry we're going to be dealing with a new shape, a sphere. And because this shape is new, we're actually going to put the surface area and the volume information for spheres into one specific section. Now, a lot of times when people talk about a sphere, they think of things like globes, or they'll think of a basketball. Some kind of three-dimensional circle is how I've heard students respond to this. So let's take a look at some vocabulary. First of all, you're going to have a radius in a sphere just like you do in any other circular shape. The big deal with this one is a radius can go from the center, which is interior of your shape, to any spot on the circle, and they'll all be the same distance. Now the great circle is a cross section where you can kind of cut the sphere and it goes right through the center. Now if I were to cut this right in half, it would cut it into two equal halves. So if you think about a globe, it would be the line where the equator is. Circumference of a sphere is the circumference of the circle that usually runs right down the middle through the center, and this circle is the biggest circle of all the cross sections that you could possibly make inside of a sphere. Now a hemisphere is when you actually cut on this great circle and it cuts into two pieces. Those would be hemispheres. A lot of this conversation of hemispheres you'll hear again when you talk about things like geography and you're talking about where things are actually located. Now to do surface area, you'll see that the formula here for the surface area of a sphere is 4 times pi times your radius. Now again, you have to be careful in the directions that you get because some will be in terms of pi and some will not. So example number 1, find the surface area of this sphere. Leave your answer in terms of pi. So here you can see you're in terms of pi. Okay, now on this kind of a problem, it is important for us to go through and know that the diameter here is 8, which makes the radius 4. So if I'm plugging it into this formula, I know that my radius is going to be 4. So if I were to plug this in, remember if you're doing in terms of pi, I'm going to do 4 times 4 squared. So 4 times 4 squared would give me 64. So my surface area would be 64 pi meters squared. Now again, it's going to be squared because it's area. So because area and volume are both done in this section, remember area has to be the squared. If this were volume, that would have to be cubed. Okay, now the next one. Find the surface area of a melon with the circumference of 18 inches. Round to the nearest 10 inches squared. So first of all, if I'm talking about circumference, the formula that I've always dealt with circumference usually looks like this. Now they tell us in this one that we know that our circumference is 18. And I have no idea what the radius is. If I were to solve this for r, I could find the radius, and then I could use that information to plug into the formula that we just did with surface area. So to get radius by itself, I would divide both sides by 2 pi. These would cancel. So if I did 18 divided by 2 pi, and again, be careful you put parentheses around that whole thing, I get 2.86. Now I'm just rounding it to that. And I know it says to the nearest 10 inches squared, but that's not till the end. So let's actually take this and plug it in for our radius. So if I do, let me move this up just a little bit. Surface area equals 4 times pi times 2.86 squared. Now if I did that surface area, I get 102.78, and it keeps going. So if I had to do this to the nearest 10, that would be right here. And this 2 is not enough to round up. So my surface area would round to 100 inches squared. Now listen, I can see a lot of people doing this as their answer and putting that inches squared on there. And that's where a lot of people are going to have their problem. Not that they didn't solve it correctly, but they didn't follow the directions. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Okay, now we're going to go on to volume of a sphere. So this is our formula for volume. Now this is really different because there's actually a fraction in there. So when you're writing it out, most people would probably write it like this. So keep that in mind. This part, when I did parentheses 4 divided by 3 and close parentheses, this is actually the way I write it in my calculator so I can keep my stuff straight. So on this problem, on example number 3, it says find the volume of a sphere. Leave your answer in terms of pi. Okay, in this one I know that my radius was 6. So I'm actually going to plug in a 6 where the radius is at. Now remember, if this is in terms of pi, this is going to go in my calculator, and this is going to go into my calculator. So if I plug that in, I'm going to end up with 288 pi, and then it's going to be meters cubed. Now remember, cubed because we're talking about volume. You're going to switch back and forth, so again, pay attention to what you're solving for. Okay, let's try one more. What is the volume of a sphere is 5,000 meters cubed. What is the surface area? So originally they're starting out by talking about volume. And they say your volume is 5,000. Now this is going to be a problem like we did with that one that gave us the circumference. We're actually going to have to work backwards a little bit. If I can get my radius by itself and solve for it, then I can actually plug it in. So listen, the hardest part for people is this fraction. So if I multiply both sides by the reciprocal, these would cancel out. So if I were to go through and start solving this, grab my calculator here. So 3 divided by 4 times 5,000 is going to be 3,750. Okay, now I need to get rid of pi. So I'm going to divide it by pi. So that means that these will cancel out. I'm going to move the r cubed to this side just so you can see what I'm doing. 3,750 divided by pi would be 1193.662073. Now we haven't talked about this before, but if it were squared, I would do a square root. So if I want to get r and this is cubed, that means I actually have to do the cube root of this number. So if I do the cube root, I'm going to end up with 10.61, just a rounded value for my radius. And then I can go back up here and plug this in. So surface area equals 4 times pi times 10.61 squared. So my surface area is going to end up being 1414.6 meters squared. Now these are almost like two-step problems, so you're going to have to keep that in mind as you're solving.